Okay, well, maybe we'll kick things off just as folks are joining in. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Michael Donaldson, and I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Canadian Science Publishing, and I'm joined by Becky Furlong, who's our Editorial Director for Biology and Environmental Sciences, also at Canadian Science Publishing. It's a great pleasure to be able to present to you today, and thank you all for joining in. The title of our presentation today is Navigating the Path to Publication. And Canadian Science Publishing recognizes and respects the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across the lands known as Canada and worldwide, on whose territories we and our research contributors are privileged to live, work, and learn. We gratefully acknowledge the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, on whose unceded and unsurrendered territory our Ottawa head office is located for Canadian Science Publishing, and also the region that both Becky and I are joining you from today. A few housekeeping items. If you're comfortable introducing yourself in the chat, please do. We'd love to know who's in the audience and where you're joining us from. So please feel free to pop your name and location into the chat. Please also note that the webinar is being recorded, and we will make that recording available afterwards as well. We will be stopping the recording just before the Q&A portion of the webinar, but the webinar itself will be recorded in full. Please keep an eye on the chat window throughout the duration of the presentation, because our Canadian Science Publishing team will be pasting some relevant resources and links into the chat throughout the webinar. We would like this session to be informative and interactive, so we welcome questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom, which you'll see just on the bottom of your Zoom window, and we'll have lots of time for questions and discussion at the end of the presentation. So perhaps we'll go to the next slide, please. So just a little overview of what's on tap for our presentation today. We'll be talking about the scientific publishing process, including questions like what are editors looking for, an overview of peer review models, a discussion of open access and open science and some of the terminology associated with the open movement of research, an overview of open data, and then we'll be concluding the session with an overview of the Open Access Week 2024 and the theme of this year's Open Access Week, which is community over commercialization. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about Canadian Science Publishing for those that may be new to us. We're Canada's largest not-for-profit publisher of international scientific journals. CSP is a mission-driven organization, and our mission is to enhance the reach, rigor, and relevance of science so that people can find, trust, and use it. Our vision is that everyone has access to scientific knowledge for a sustainable future. And with the theme of Open Access Week this year being community over commercialization, CSP is a community publisher, and we're run by researchers for researchers. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to hand it off to Becky, who's going to go over the publication process.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you all today. Scientific publishing can be confusing, and today we hope to demystify some of it. Sometimes it can feel like you submit your paper into a black box and eventually a decision comes, but what's actually going on? So next slide, please. Scientific journals are not open platforms like blogs or social media where anything can be published. They curate and validate content prior to publication, and this brings some level of trust in the content. It's not a perfect process, and your own judgment as a reader is still needed. Retractions and corrections can and do happen, and the system can be gamed by bad actors if editors and publishers take their eye off the ball. But despite many attempts to come up with alternative approaches, this is the best we have for now. There are usually several layers of assessment between submission of a manuscript and a decision to publish it, starting with administrative checking, which ensures that the authors have submitted an actual paper and not their grocery list, checking that various ethical and reporting guidelines have been adhered to, and then passing it on to the next level of assessment, which is with the editor. At all Canadian Science Publishing journals, the editor-in-chief will be an academic themselves. They assess the manuscript and make sure it is suitable for the journal, that it fits the scope and it meets their expectations in terms of advance and interest. They may reject it at this stage, or they will move it into the next level by inviting peer reviewers to assess it. On many journals, there's a group of associate editors who take care of some parts of this process as well. Peer review itself can take some time. Usually multiple reviewers have to be invited until the editor finds someone who's able and willing. Two or sometimes more reviewers will then assess the manuscript in depth and make a recommendation about its publishability. The editor then reads the reports and decides whether to ask for revisions, whether to reject the manuscript, or to accept for publication. The manuscript can go round this loop a few times before it's accepted, at which point the publisher staff take over and work with the authors to get the manuscript ready to publish. As well as organising typesetting, proofreading, and publication online and sometimes in print, they also make sure the published article is indexed and searchable in databases like PubMed and will be available in perpetuity. So let's have a quick look at the publisher role in more detail. Next slide, please. Publishers like Canadian Science Publishing carry out multiple roles behind the scenes. We provide the systems and the staff to manage manuscript submissions and peer review administration. We also increasingly provide ethical expertise to help editors when authors or peer reviewers don't follow good practice, or when editors themselves aren't acting with proper integrity, or when retractions or corrections of published papers are needed. We provide copy editing, proofreading, and layout of published papers, and we ensure they're added to the databases that academics and libraries use to find research. We provide marketing services to tell researchers what's being published, and we support editors in developing their journals and encouraging submissions in new or exciting fields of research. We manage copyright, and we work with libraries and funders to provide subscriptions and open access deals. And we ensure that journal content is preserved in perpetuity as part of the permanent scholarly record. For example, if a journal were to close, the content will still be available forever, and it can't be changed without a proper documented process. So let's go back to publishing. We aren't going to talk about the best way to write an abstract or what to put in each section of the paper, because this can be highly dependent on the norms of the research field or the requirements of the journal, or even the requirements of the specific article type. But we can discuss a few general points about submitting. There are a few things that can help a paper make it through those layers of assessment without being returned to the authors for reasons that have nothing to do with the actual science that was carried out. So next slide, please. Of course, as a researcher and an author, you will already have followed good research practices, that's a given. But there are additional good practices that relate to how you report it. So let's go over some of those. Good reporting and clarity of presentation can make it easier for journal staff and editors to see what you've done, as well as being more transparent for readers when you're eventually accepted for publication. These are general points, and they may not apply to all journals, all article types, or all study designs. When in doubt, stick to what the journal webpage says, and this should be your first port of call before submitting. Facet's journal, for example, has minimal requirements for formatting prior to submission, whereas other journals can be stricter. All authors must meet the criteria for authorship and should agree to the content of the paper. If you're not sure whether someone meets the criteria for authorship, there is the credit taxonomy, which helps to guide authors. There may be reporting guidelines appropriate to your research, which you should follow, and you may need to include additional flowcharts to show these. If you deposit your data in a public repository, which may be mandatory for some journals and article types, you should make sure you state this in the manuscript. If your research is on humans or animals, you should mention any ethical approvals or consent processes that were undertaken. You should declare any competing interests. Most of the time, these won't preclude publication, but it can be embarrassing if they turn up later. If you don't have any, you should state this as well. Don't recycle text from others or from your own previous work without proper attribution. If you're reusing any images, visuals, or other audio, you may need to get permission from the people who originally published it. And finally, don't submit simultaneously to multiple journals. This is partly administrative. Simultaneous submission can lead to overloading of admin staff, editors, and peer reviewers. And it can also lead to issues around integrity. When your research is accepted and published, it becomes part of the scholarly record, and there is a formal expectation that there is only one version of record for each paper or piece of research, except for some very specific circumstances. It would be considered as fraud or an issue of research integrity if you were to submit to multiple journals and end up publishing the same work twice. Next slide, please. By making sure your paper is complete, correctly formatted, and well reported, you will hopefully not get stuck in the admin checks, and your manuscript will find itself on the desk of the editor-in-chief. Editors-in-chief are busy people. They are often senior academics, and while they're very committed to their journals and will read each submitted manuscript very carefully, they will also appreciate it if you can make this easier for them. Editors will find it useful if you can summarize some of the points for them in a covering letter. You can also touch upon some of these points in your introduction and conclusion. Remember, you're not writing a murder mystery, and readers will expect you to state upfront what to expect from the work, summarizing the main points within the abstract and again in the final paragraph of the introduction. You should make sure that you treat other people's work fairly and give due credit to the papers you're building upon or any previous studies that came to different conclusions. Remember, the editor and the peer reviewers are experts in the field, and their judgment may be influenced if they either think that you don't know the field or that you're trying to hide something. Equally, for the same reason, don't overreach your conclusions. It can be tempting, especially in today's competitive world, but it's unlikely to do you any favors in the long run. Next slide, please. As mentioned previously, peer review is a core part of the assessment process that differentiates a scholarly publication from blogs, preprints, and other online content. By having several experts look at the manuscript in detail, this is a form of validation that to the best of their knowledge, the work was carried out properly and the conclusions are supported. On some journals, the peer reviewers are also asked to comment on the level of advance, or there may be specialist statistical and methodological reviewers. As an author, don't be alarmed if the peer review reports are quite different from one another or pick up on different points. It's the editor's job to balance those different reports with their knowledge of the reviewer's expertise and their knowledge of the journal to decide whether a manuscript is suitable for publication in this journal. Peer review has many problems, more than we have time to tackle today, but it's the best approach we have for validation of a study. The world of research and the world of publishing are changing fast, and peer review is a line of defense against fraudulent research practices and against low quality or flawed research. Because of the trust placed in the publishing process, publication of poorly supported or incorrect results could lead to others attempting to build on those results, which would waste grant money and perhaps even lead to incorrect or ineffective therapies or treatments. So it is really important. However, the increasing number of manuscripts being submitted for publication, some of which are from paper mills and report fake research, is leading to an increased burden on some researchers acting as peer reviewers. Academics are already overloaded and time poor, and it's harder and harder for editors to find enough reviewers. Some have described this as a crisis in peer review. Furthermore, while some academics are frequently asked to review, others are never asked at all, which may perpetuate biases in the research ecosystem. Finally, there's an ongoing debate about how to motivate peer reviewers. Simply paying peer reviewers is a suggestion that often comes up, but there are several publishers that have tried this, and it's incredibly difficult to do in practice, as well as potentially motivating the wrong people to peer review. The research and publishing community often discuss the possibility of payment in kind, such as APC discounts or other services. Again, not easy to administrate. In parallel, finding a better way to surface or acknowledge the work done by reviewers might help. We'll touch upon this in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So let's look at another tricky problem in peer review, which is around fairness and openness. There are actually several different flavors of peer review. I've focused on the three most common kinds here, but there are others. So firstly, we have single anonymized peer review, which you may know as single blinded peer review. That's a phrase that we don't use anymore. The reviewers have access to the author information, but they are anonymous to the author, and they're usually anonymous to the readers as well. In double anonymized peer review, the author information is removed from the paper, and the authors and the reviewers are therefore anonymous to each other during the whole process. The author information is reinstated upon publication. In open peer review, the reviewers have access to the author information, as in single anonymized. The authors have access to the peer reviewer information at some point in the process, usually towards the end. And the reviewer identity and the reviewer reports are usually available to readers on publication as well. Next slide, please. Some argue that single anonymous peer review allows conscious or unconscious bias on the part of the reviewer based on the reputation of the researcher, the reputation of their institute, the location of their institute, or characteristics such as gender or ethnicity, which might be inferred from their name. However, it has been the standard model for a long time, and many feel it is not perfect, but good enough in most circumstances. Open peer review brings biases and bad behavior into the open and balances some of the power dynamic between the author and the reviewer by giving the author and the reader more information. Reviewers often provide a more careful review or use more constructive language when they know their report will be openly available. However, reviewers under this model may be worried about the effects on their future career. If they provide a critical review for someone who later has influence on the success of their grant or job application, this is a particular perceived barrier for more junior researchers. Open peer review has been in practice for at least 20 years, and there are many proponents of it as being a core aspect of open science and also making reviewer acknowledgement and recognition easy. Double anonymous peer review balances the power dynamic in a different way by reducing the possibility of bias based on author list information. For example, research into this at an ecology journal has shown that double anonymous does make a difference. It doesn't improve outcomes for underrepresented or marginalized groups. However, it removes the advantages that come from a good reputation, which still leads to a more level playing field. However, it is hard to completely anonymize manuscripts, particularly in small fields or when focused on specific regions or populations. And it leaves a lot of peer review behind closed doors, which makes it hard to identify reviewers and hard to call out poor practice. Next slide, please. Hopefully, the peer reviewers provide a glowing report, the editor suggests just some minor revisions, and the paper can move on through the publication process. But unfortunately, the paper may not make it through on the first try and may receive a rejection decision. Sometimes the reviewer could spot real problems with the research, and the authors have to go back and analyze the data or rework it to tell a different or a less strong story. Sometimes there are issues with the way the research is reported or how the conclusions are expressed, which can be fixed. And sometimes the paper just wasn't right for that journal. Next slide, please. So let's take a step back in the process now and think about how to choose the journal to send the manuscript to. There are many aspects that researchers can take into account when deciding where to submit. These include things they know about the journal from experience or from word of mouth, as well as measurables like page charges or article processing charges, and metrics such as impact factor or altmetrics. Next slide, please. In a traditional publishing model, journals are available by subscription. This means that the university library pays to allow access for the content for members of that institution. This is a low-cost model from the individual researcher's point of view, but expensive for the university library. It's also rare for people outside academia to have a subscription, and thus the paper may not be available to everyone globally who wants to read it. One way to ensure wider availability to readers is via open access. Open access has been around for over 20 years, and we will talk in more detail about how it works in the next section. For those who are interested in making research more equitable, available, and transparent, open access and open science practices may align well with their values. However, there are costs associated with publishing OA, even when the publisher is not for profit, which may be prohibitive for some authors. And so in the second part of this talk, I will hand back to Michael, who's going to look at open access and open science in more detail.
That's great. Thank you very much, Becky. And just a reminder to folks, if you do have questions, you're welcome to use the Q&A feature within Zoom to add those there, and we'll make sure we have lots of time at the end to address them. But as Becky mentioned, we're now talking about open access and open science, leading into the theme of the webinar overall, which is the Open Access Week Community Over Commercialization theme. So we'll begin with a bit of an overview of open science and open access and what they're all about. Next slide, please. So in terms of open science, it's really an umbrella term. It covers a lot of different aspects of the scientific and research processes. And really, it's all about making those outputs of scientific research available and discoverable so that people can use them and be able to build on them and access them. So really, in the simplest terms, it's all about making outputs of scientific research available. But the definition does go a little bit more broadly than that. And I think there's a really great definition that came from the UNESCO recommendation on open science. And we'll pop a link to that document in the chat. It's a really great resource. It gives an overview of what open science is really all about. And I think it goes bigger than just making content available and just making different aspects of scientific research available. It's quite a bit more broad than that. It's meant to be an inclusive movement aimed at making scientific knowledge multilingual, openly available, accessible to all, fostering collaboration, sharing information, and involving societal actors in the process of knowledge creation, evaluation, and communication across all disciplines through open scientific knowledge, infrastructures, communication, engagement, and dialogue. So it's definitely that's a real mouthful in terms of that broader definition of open science. But I think it's really important to think about those philosophical aspects of making research open and the fact that it does really remove barriers and enable greater participation amongst researchers, but also amongst the broader scholarly community and other stakeholders, including the public as well. Next slide, please. Now, open access is another term that falls under that open science umbrella. In this case, it's referring more to research articles and making research articles freely available and with unrestricted access, so no barriers to accessing published research articles, published journal articles. And there's kind of two parts to this definition. The first one is really about making the content available. But the second is about the licensing requirements around those documents and how readers then can take the information that's in a scholarly research article and be able to build on it, share it, and sort of reuse that content in different ways. And one of the most common licenses that applies to open access content is a CC-BY license. And that's an article type that enables really the free use of the content within the manuscript itself, where authors can reuse that content in different ways. They can build on it, they can borrow from it, and they can also exchange it with other users as well. But the key is that there has to be attribution or citation back to the original article to be able to use that license in that context. So it's really all about access to the content, but it's also about how users can utilize that content too. And when it comes to open access, there's a number of terms, almost an overwhelming number of terms of the different flavors of open access, whether it's diamond or gold or green, bronze, and so on. And Canadian Science Publishing created an open access glossary that has a lot of these open access terms and sort of publishing related terms. And we've just popped that into the chat too for anyone that's interested in taking a look at some of that terminology. So some of it is very specific to publishing, but it's gives a bit more context around some of the terms that we often use and kind of take for granted in the publishing world. Next slide, please. So the question then is why open? And Becky talked about this a little bit as well, just in the latter portion of her presentation, really kind of touching on the areas that open science can sort of enable from the philosophical perspective. And I think at the heart of open, it really is about removing barriers. It's a way for us to get scientific information out to a broader audience without having to worry about things like paywalls, which can make a real divide in terms of who can access content and who cannot. So especially when it comes to researchers who were getting subscription access through their institution, in an open access world, we don't need to worry about those subscriptions. Instead, it's more focused just in on how anyone can access the content, whether it's researchers, other stakeholders, or the public as well. So by removing new barriers and kind of expanding that reach of the content, we're also able to engage new audiences as well with open access and open science. That in turn can increase the impact as well. And we can think about impact in terms of things like citations. So researchers citing the content that it's easier to cite content that is openly available, but it's also the societal impact as well, how that content can reach new audiences and be able to enable people that historically maybe weren't able to access that type of scientific information now can under an open access paradigm. So this can accelerate research. It can really make the research process much faster. It can also reduce duplication as well, where authors aren't sort of inadvertently redoing work that's been done previously because there's now greater access to that research. And also, perhaps most importantly, it also increases transparency as well and really builds trust into the scholarly research enterprise. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about open data towards the end of the presentation as well. So I just wanted to just share this this great quote from Melissa Hageman from the Budapest Open Access Initiative. And that group was actually one of the originators of the term open access. And I think they sort of coined that term and made it more widely applicable about over 20 years ago now. And Melissa states that OA is not an end in itself, but it's a means to other ends. So above all, it's about the equity, the quality, the usability, and sustainability of research. And I think that's a powerful statement. It really ties in nicely with that UNESCO recommendation on open science, that there's really a philosophical aspect to open research in different capacities. And it really is about equity, sustainability, and really trying to enhance the research landscape. Next slide. So in terms of impact, I mentioned that there's sort of citation-related impact. There's also societal impact of open access as well. But I found this interesting study that came out earlier this year that was looking at the citations for open content versus closed content. And what was found was that it wasn't simply just that open content was cited more often, which it was, but it's also that there's a greater diversity of citations. And they found diversity amongst the institutions that were citing the work, the open access work, the countries, different regions, and also different fields of research as well. And I think the real takeaway from this study was that OA can help to remove barriers and does enable more diverse users to access and benefit from the content as well. So I think that's kind of an interesting view of open access and how it helps to open up new doors for new user groups as well. Next slide, please. So the question is open access growing globally? And the answer is yes, although some may say that it's not growing fast enough, but we definitely have seen quite a bit of an increase over the past 10 or 15 years in terms of open access growth. And what's interesting too is that this data set is looking at international publications. It's covering all different scientific disciplines and other disciplines as well, social sciences, arts and humanities. Really, all research disciplines are captured here using the Dimensions database. And what the trend sort of shows is that we're seeing a decrease in closed content. So the black bars are shrinking over time. So there's less closed content being published year over year. And we're seeing an increase in the gold open access or paid open access, the yellow bars, increasing over time. And the free access, which is sometimes referred to as green open access, I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment as well. It's where the accepted version of a manuscript is placed into a repository. So not the final version of record, but the accepted version, which has stayed fairly steady at around 20%. But overall, if you kind of combine the gold open access bars and the green free access bars, you can see that there's a lot more open content being published each year now than there was even a few years ago. So it's definitely, we're definitely seeing growth in terms of open access. Next slide. And a big driver, I think, for the increase in open access, especially over the past 5 or 6 years, has been that there's been a number of new policies that have been put forward by different groups that are part of the research ecosystem. So we've seen some real changes amongst the international frameworks. Plan S, who some of you may have heard of before, they represent a group of different funders. They started off in Europe, but it's really got a global participation now as well. There's been there's a real push towards immediate and full open access amongst research that's funded by the funders participating with that group. Similarly, the World Health Organization, Food and Agriculture Organization, and other international research organizations as well have really moved towards a full and immediate open access. At the national level as well, many countries now have their own national open access policy. Since we're Canadian Science Publishing and we're based in Canada, I'll focus a little bit on the Canadian Tri-Agency policy in the next slide, but it's really representative of a lot of similar policies that are happening at the national level across the globe. And individually, different funders have also really put forward a series of different requirements related to open access, and in particular that demand for immediate open access. So that's true for the Gates Foundation, for Wellcome Trust, and for Horizon Europe, as well as a number of other funders as well that they're going that route. So the real takeaway, I think, is that it's most of the policies, whether they're operating at the international, national, or funder levels, now do require immediate open access. Next slide, please. So just focusing in a little bit on Canada's tri-agency open access policy, and I won't spend too much time on it because I know we do have an international audience joining us as well. But the Canadian Tri-Agency is made up of three major funding organizations. There's the Canadian Institution of Health Research, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council, and the Social Sciences and Humanity Research Council of Canada. And these three agencies together fund the majority of Canadian research across all those different disciplines that they represent. And they've worked together to develop a policy that's been in effect since about 2015 that requires open access of any research that they fund, any research paper arriving from the research that they fund. But under the previous policy, there was a one-year embargo before the content was to be made open. There was a bit of an embargo or grace period until the content was made open. But now the policy is actually in revision, and it's being set to be re-released at the end of 2025 with a move towards immediate and full open access at the time of publication. So it's a big process involving a lot of different stakeholders. A lot of the scholarly community is kind of involved in helping to inform these policies, or this policy. And currently, there have been some consultations have taken place with the different stakeholder groups within Canada, as well as some other international participants as well. And right now, the different components of the policy are being drafted, and they're set to release towards the end of 2025, so about a year from now. So we'll definitely be watching that policy because it does impact a lot of the research that's happening here in Canada. And I think that this policy is also very representative of the other national policies that are happening in other countries all over the world as well, that are kind of following suit, moving towards an immediate open access requirement. Next slide, please. So just in general, there's a few different routes that authors can use to comply with open access requirements. And this isn't the be-all to end-all list. This is a pretty high-level overview. So certain researchers may have other requirements that they need to meet and be aware of. But just in general, there's a few different ways that authors can comply. One way is through gold or diamond open access. And in that case, the distinction between those two modes of open access are that gold open access, typically, it applies to journals that are either fully open access, where in some cases an author will pay a fee, like an article processing charge fee, to make their paper available as open access at the time of publication. So no delays, no embargoes, and it accompanies a CC-BY license with the article as well. That can apply to fully gold open access journals. It can also apply to what's called hybrid journals as well, where some of the content might be held behind a paywall, but then certain articles are made open access. So those routes typically comply with most funder requirements. And similarly, some journals are diamond open access journals, and that means that it's the journal itself doesn't charge an article processing fee. There's usually a third-party funder that supports the journal, and it's still free for all the readers to access the content as well. And typically in those cases, for Diamond OA journals, the paper is also immediately open access on publication, and the CC-BY license also accompanies it. So that's kind of one route. The other route that sort of overlaps with the gold or diamond routes at times as well is other open access partnerships. And in some cases, researchers that are affiliated with different universities, you may know that your library has certain agreements that they have in place with different publishers, so that authors from those institutions are able to publish their work as open access in the journals that are included in those agreements. So transformative agreements include things like read and publish and read type arrangements as well. And there's other variations of that. There's community action models. That's a very similar approach where libraries and other funders are coming together to help support open access publication. And other modes like subscribe to open, where typically a journal that was previously a subscription access journal has transferred over to be open access, and it's the subscribers that are paying to make that content open and available. So those series of routes, and there's a few other variations there as well, they provide authors with a couple variations or a couple options that they can consider when trying to publish their work as open access. Another possible route too, which is also free to authors, is the green open access route, and that's where the accepted version of an article is placed into a repository. And many journals offer that feature. The only challenge that sometimes is certain journals have an embargo period, so a time between when the article is published and when it can be deposited into an open access repository. And some journals allow an immediate deposit of the article into a repository, like Canadian Science Publishing's journals are all immediate. So that's something else to consider there as well, that they're, depending on the journal, you might just have to check to make sure that the journal doesn't have an embargo period if your funder requires immediate open access. Next slide, please. So now we'll move on to open data, which is another component of open science. And open data really is all about making data freely available for anyone to access it, use it, modify it, and share it without any barriers or restrictions. And not all data can be shared. There's certainly privacy considerations and confidentiality considerations that need to be taken into account for certain data sets. So we often say when we're talking about open data, we say, keep your data as open as possible and as closed as necessary, depending on the type of data that you're looking to share. For data that can be freely shared, there's a number of benefits to doing so. And I think a lot of these benefits from kind of a philosophical viewpoint overlap with those other benefits of open science and open access as well. So the first one that kind of comes to mind is transparency. So if you're making your data openly available, it really does help to build in trust into your data set by making it available for others to be able to analyze and to view. It also helps with reproducibility as well. So if a study design wanted to be replicated, to be able to review those results and those analyses, making the data available and well documented can really help with that process. We also look at open data as a way of reducing duplication, because in some cases, there's quite a bit of time and money and energy that goes into creating those data sets and gathering the data and carrying out the studies to create the data as well. So by making the data available, it can reduce duplication for other authors. That frees up resources and certainly time as well, and enables others to really build on research that has been already established by a research group. With that idea in mind as well, open data really enhances collaboration too, because it means that there can be greater participation in terms of study design and study analyses associated with open data. And I think that really helps to bring in new collaborations amongst different stakeholder groups, and also helps to facilitate inclusion as well and participation in the research and data analysis and eventually publication as well for those data sets. Next slide, please. So open data is one aspect of getting your data out there, but certainly finding a place to put your data so others can find it and use it is really important as well. And I think often when we think about data repositories and ways of getting data out there, often the FAIR principles are considered as a way of making sure that the data can be utilized and found and really built upon. So FAIR refers to findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data as well. So essentially, in terms of the findable piece, having data sets that are accompanied by a persistent identifier and it can be easily found through search engines and through searching through the data repositories, keyword searches, and so on is really important. Having no barriers to being able to access that data set is really important as well. It needs to be easy to find, easy to access, no additional hoops to jump through to be able to get the data set and for others to be able to utilize it. Interoperable, really trying to find ways to make sure that your data are stored in a standard format that's easy for others to be able to utilize and build on as well. And thinking about it not just for interoperability today, but also into the future as well. And reusable as well. So that is really about being complying with standards for your research discipline, and also really considering how the metadata, so the information about your data set, is really complete and really well documents the methodology used to collect the data and to analyze it, and stores all the relevant information about the data itself so that others can then take that data set and be able to use it for their own purposes at a later date. So just, I guess, in summary, publishing your data set into a data repository, it really can help to make your data more citable, more findable, traceable, reproducible, and also protected as well for longer term. So those repositories have the functionality built in to be able to store the data set long term in an archive way, so that the data is going to be available well into the future as well for others to continue to utilize. And one example of a data repository is Dryad. There's a number of other repositories, some that are discipline specific or institution specific, but Dryad is one of the larger ones. We just linked it in the chat there as well. And when it comes to Dryad, Canadian Science Publishing does have a partnership with them for some of our journals where authors who publish their paper through CSP's journals can also deposit their data sets directly to Dryad as well. Which just is a great way to be able to kind of link the research paper with the data set as well. Next slide, please. And lastly, I'll just conclude with our Open Access Week 2024 theme. And this year's theme, as I mentioned at the outset, it's community over commercialization. And Open Access Week is an international movement, and it's been going for a number of years now. And each year there's a different theme that's chosen, and a lot of the discussion around the open access and open science usually centers around that theme. And for those that maybe tuned into our webinar last year, our CSP webinar last year, or who may have been aware of the theme from last year, this year's theme is actually the same as last year. It's community over commercialization again. And the reason for that was that I think the discussion around community over commercialization was so strong, and there's just so many viewpoints and questions that were raised, I think, during last year's Open Access Week, that the decision was made to revisit that same theme again. And the purpose of revisiting that theme and kind of the lens that is being looked through this year, it's all about prioritizing approaches to open scholarship that serve the best interests of the public and the academic community. And I think that's a really strong message. And certainly CSP, we view ourselves as a community publisher as well. And our community is so important to us. And I think this theme really resonates well with us at CSP. And actually, if we go to the next slide, I'll just give a little overview of what community means from our perspective. And often we think of community being kind of our journal community, because we do publish journals in different disciplines, and each journal really has their own community. And the community is comprised of a number of different actors, and we've listed some of them here. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but really it comes down to the knowledge creators and knowledge users, and that's many of the folks who are joining us here on the webinar. There are authors, our editors, our reviewers, our readers, the group that really provides so much to the journal themselves, volunteering their time as peer reviewers, volunteering their time as editors, contributing their hard work as authors to be able to publish their work, and then those also that access and read the content and utilize it in different contexts as well, including practitioners and other folks outside of maybe the academic world. Our community is also involves the funding organizations, so the funders that support the research, that really help to be able to allow those studies to be developed and to be published. Publishers ourselves and our other publishing partners out in the world. The universities and the libraries who support our journals in various different ways, whether it's through subscription to closed access journals or through helping funding through open access journals or partnering with us in other aspects as well. Various industry stakeholders are such a huge part of our community too, especially for the more applied research that's being utilized in different contexts where industry is really taking that data and being able to utilize it and build on it. And one group that is really important to each of our journal communities is the academic societies. And most of our journals have partner organizations that are academic societies that they're affiliated with. And we popped a link to a blog post that we have just published this week that really talks about how academic societies help to support the journal community and vice versa as well. That just discussing that relationship between academic societies and journals. And it's such an important aspect of what we do as a journal publisher. And it's a really rewarding aspect of our work to be able to work with those communities as well. It's really, we kind of see those partnerships as being our North Star in a lot of ways, and really trying to find ways to really enhance those relationships over time, which I think really helps to build the journal community up as well. So I think with that, we can move to the next slide. And we just have our contact information here. We definitely would be happy to take any questions offline, or if you want to reach out to us for any reason, we'd definitely love to hear from you.